LaBoucane-Benson.
Sorry. Honourable Senators, with leave of the Senate and notwithstanding Rule 5-5B, I move that this bill be read a third time now.
Is leave granted, Honourable Senators?
Agreed.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator LaBoucane-Benson, seconded by the Honourable Senator Simon, that the bill as amended be read a third time now. On debate, Senator LaBoucane-Benson.
Thank you, Speaker. I begin today by acknowledging both the traditional lands of the Algonquin peoples as well as my Métis ancestors. I'm pleased to offer these final thoughts on Bill C-92. Honourable Senators, in 2019, the child welfare system remains a colonial artifact of the residential school system. Service provision is still enabled by the Indian Act. That's the status quo. In 1950, there were almost no Indigenous children on the child welfare caseload because they were all at residential school. However, in the early 1960s, the government realized that the residential school experiment was not working because, on one hand, the assimilation agenda was failing. Indigenous children were leaving residential schools without a connection to the broader Canadian society. They were not assimilated. And on the other hand, many children were also leaving residential schools with significant mental health issues connected to the colonization of their identity, lack of training in self-management, and the physical, sexual, emotional, and spiritual abuse that many suffered at the hands of school staff. So the government turned its assimilation tactic from residential schools, and it landed squarely on child welfare and adoption. They believed that the permanent placement of Indigenous children into non-Indigenous families would complete their mission of assimilation and the eradication of Indigenous culture. The federal government transferred jurisdiction of child welfare to the provinces. Indigenous child welfare policies and practice were then founded on the assumption that for Indigenous children to thrive, they needed to be raised and educated in Euro-Canadian society, a belief that is connected at its core to the colonial assumption that Indigenous people are primitive and unable to care for themselves. Both adoption and residential schools proved to be hostile environments for Indigenous children. They were not raised with a nurturing adult that could be trusted, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report described the children as being starved for attention, becoming adults with no experience of healthy family relationships to draw on. And now I'm making this intergenerational case because many Indigenous children grew up and they passed on their sense of identity confusion, isolation, hopelessness, and the inability to form trusting relationship to their children. This is what we call historic trauma. It places the trauma of colonization, including residential schools, into an intergenerational context and helps us to understand the overrepresentation of Indigenous children and families in the child welfare system across our country. And colleagues, the truth is that while the colonial assumptions that inform child welfare policy have remained mostly intact, the practices that express these ideas have morphed over the years. Since the 1960s, children have been apprehended due to the issues of community-wide structural inadequacies that individual parents cannot rectify. A 2016 report that the worst poverty is experienced by Indigenous children. It stated that across Canada, 51% of status First Nation children live in poverty, and if we look only on reserves, that number rises to 60%. And as a social indicator of health, children who experience persistent poverty are at higher risks of suffering health problems, developmental delays, and behavior disorders. They tend to attain lower levels of education and are more likely to live in poverty, experience homelessness, and incarceration as adults. And what has been our response to this shameful reality? Rather than lifting Indigenous families out of poverty with housing, income, and employment supports, our society has chosen to blame them for the economic policies of the Indian Act and pay other families to provide foster care. In the process, we have privileged assimilation into Western culture and community over the Indigenous child's connection to their family and culture. And we've done this under the guise of the best interest of the child. For 60 years, child welfare has been a catch-all system for the ongoing multi-systemic failure to understand, support, and create space for the healing of Indigenous families. Rather than provide culturally competent mental health services for parents that address historic trauma, we have blamed families for their illness and addictions and taken their children. Apprehension has been used as a default response for the lack of adequate housing on First Nations and in remote communities, a punishment for families who live in communities with poor drinking water, roads that are impassable for 4 months of the year, and other infrastructure neglects that have plagued First Nations and remote communities for decades. Although many provinces already have created policies that prevent apprehension solely on the basis of poverty, without supports to families that address poverty and historic trauma-informed mental health issues, Indigenous children continue to be apprehended at alarming rates. And because communities have not been fully supported to build the capacity for kinship care and other community-based placement options for their children, they continue to be placed in non-Indigenous foster care. The goal of Bill C-92 is to take a significant step forward in the process of changing this history, to repatriate jurisdiction over children's services to Indigenous peoples, to ensure the implementation of minimum standards that seek to decolonize child welfare practice, and put preventative service in place that will support Indigenous families to raise their own children. To be crystal clear, though no one advocates for leaving children to languish in poverty with their family, rather we must all call on the provinces and the federal government to work in good faith with Indigenous communities to ensure that coordination agreements are created in a timely way, and they bring housing, income support, and mental health departments and their funding to the table. If governments create coordination agreements that continue to focus only on intervention and ignore prevention, nothing will change, and we will have failed Indigenous children yet again. As the Yellowhead Institute stated, without adequate and sustainable funding agreements, Indigenous people will be left to administer their own poverty. These agreements need to be creative and well-resourced to support families to break the cycle of historic trauma, to create the space for on-the-ground healing and true reconciliation. Why should we expect anything less for Indigenous children, who are gifts from the Creator and our hope for the future? Honourable Senators, I want to thank the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples for their hard work on Bill C-92. From our pre-study to drafting reports and the clause-by-clause consideration yesterday, I'm so grateful for every member's demonstrated commitment to improving the bill and, by extension, the lives of Indigenous children and families. Our work was nothing less than collegial and focused, and we were efficient, largely due to the fantastic work of the clerks and the Library of Parliament staff. I want to thank them for their unwavering support during our very thorough study of the bill. You may remember that I reported our pre-study report influenced 3 significant changes to the bill in the other place. However, while it was a significant step forward from the Indian Act, while this bill is a significant step forward from the Indian Act, the legislation remains imperfect. The committee has recommended further amendments to the bill, including acknowledging the inherent right to self-government of Indigenous peoples, the remediation of family socioeconomic conditions that led to child neglect, as well as the establishment of an Indigenous Advisory Committee to assist the minister in this work. But to be honest, the disentangling of provincial jurisdiction from Indigenous child welfare and reducing the overrepresentation is a complicated process. I anticipate I will be working on this piece of legislation for many years to come, and I invite you to help me. Honourable Senators, I finish my work as sponsor with a message of gratitude. It's been an honour to steward this important bill through the Senate. Hi.